Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating, honestly pretty dense piece of academic literature. We're unpacking an essay by Marc Bates called Dismantling Islamic Apologetics, a biblical, theological, and historical critical guide for Christian polemics. Now, you know as well as I do that theological debates can get incredibly heated and emotional, but our goal here today, totally objective. We are just mapping out Bates's specific academic framework. We're going to look strictly at how he structures his arguments, the methodologies he employs, and the exact theological claims he sets out to evaluate. So, whether you're deep into theology, a history buff, or just love seeing how complex religious arguments are constructed, this explainer is going to break down the sheer mechanics of Bates's essay. Let's get right into it.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Bates's call for a new polemical framework, look at his specific historical methodologies, and then really zoom in on the core of today's focus, the logic of Quranic transmission. After that, we'll outline what he dubs the Islamic Dilemma, and finally wrap up with his positive thesis on Promise Plan Biblical Theology.
Section 1. A new polemical framework. Let's set the stage for what Bates is actually trying to accomplish here.
Right out of the gate, Bates is calling for a massive shift in strategy. He argues that, historically, Christian responses to Islamic apologetics have been bogged down by, well, what he calls modern systematic overlays. On top of that, he notes that these responses usually default to purely defensive apologetics, basically just playing whack-a-mole and reacting to arguments as they pop up. But Bates is pitching something entirely different here. He wants to stop just playing defense. Instead, he lays out a proactive, comprehensive academic framework designed to evaluate Islamic claims on a strictly rigorous historical and textual level.
And the core dynamic he sets up is actually really interesting. He doesn't just match theology with theology. Instead, he takes those Islamic apologetic assertions and runs them straight through a strict, historical critical methodology. It's a highly methodical academic approach to evaluating religious claims. He's looking objectively at the history and the text itself, rather than just getting tangled up in the theological tradition.
Section 2. Methodologies, Exegesis, and History. Let's look a bit closer at the specific analytical tools Bates brings to the table.
To really grasp his analysis, we've got to define his terms. One of the absolute most crucial ones is tahrif. Now, tahrif refers to Islamic claims regarding scriptural corruption. Specifically, it's the assertion that the previous scriptures held by Christians and Jews have been altered or corrupted over time. Bates takes his historical critical methodology and uses it to directly evaluate the historical evidence surrounding these specific claims.
But tahrif isn't the only concept he examines. Bates methodically goes down the line, analyzing several core Islamic assertions that challenge Christian theology. We're talking about claims surrounding Christology, the nature and person of Jesus. He looks at critiques of Trinitarian language, and he examines the Islamic apologetic pushback against substitutionary atonement. Bates isn't just brushing these critiques off. He applies a text-immanent exegetical analysis to each and every one of them. He breaks the arguments down systematically to weigh their actual historical and textual merit.
Section 3. The logic of Quranic transmission. Now pay attention here, because this is really the absolute core focus of Bates's essay, as it strikes right at the foundational claims of the texts being evaluated.
Before we go any further, we need to define another vital piece of terminology, inlibration. You're probably familiar with the concept of incarnation in Christian theology, right? Well, inlibration refers to the Islamic claims of perfect Quranic transmission. It's the assertion that the scripture has been perfectly preserved and transmitted without a single error or alteration. Understanding this is absolutely essential. Why? Because Bates makes evaluating the logic behind this specific transmission a primary pillar of his historical critical framework.
Bates takes his historical critical tools and points them directly at this concept of inliberation. Specifically, he targets what's known as the standard Islamic narrative of origins. By scrutinizing the logic and the literal chains of this transmission through a strict historical lens, looking at exactly how the oral traditions were codified, passed down, and recorded, Bates argues that he exposes a historical fragility. Basically, he's suggesting that the claim of absolute, flawless preservation becomes highly vulnerable when you hold it up to standard academic historical scrutiny. This critical look at the transmission logic, it's the heavy lifting in how he attempts to dismantle the apologetic framework.
Section 4. The Islamic Dilemma. And that logical breakdown we just talked about? It leads us right into the next phase of his academic critique.
So based on his evaluation of the transmission and textual history, Bates introduces this specific concept. But what exactly is the Islamic dilemma in the context of this essay? Think about it for a second. How might historical fragility actually impact a text's internal consistency?
Well, Bates defines the Islamic dilemma as the logical self-incoherence of the Quran. Essentially, his framework sets up a paradox. He argues that if historical critical methods show the logic behind the Quran's transmission to be historically fragile, then using that exact same text to confidently claim prior scriptures were corrupted creates a massive logical contradiction. He uses the logical structures of the claims against themselves to expose what he views as an inherent incoherence. For Bates, this effectively clears the standard polemical barriers.
Section 5. The Promise, Plan, Biblical Theology. This is where Bates resolves the narrative arc of his whole essay and finally presents his positive thesis.
Having critiqued the opposing framework, Bates now relies on the work of scholar Walter C. Kaiser Jr. to construct his own. This theology is explicitly centered on Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of God's singular promise plan, stretching all the way back from Genesis 3. Bates actually uses this promise plan theology as the architectural foundation for his entire guide. It gives his framework a structured, positive theological direction rather than just being a pure critique. By dismantling the Islamic apologetic assertions, especially by hammering on that historical fragility of transmission and the resulting logical dilemma, Bates argues that he's cleared the standard polemical barriers right out of the way. And with those barriers gone, his ultimate goal is to establish an organic, progressive, redemptive unity within his own scriptural tradition. So he's pivoting. He goes from critique to demonstrating the internal cohesion of the biblical text through this promise plan lens. To wrap his argument up, Bates concludes that the 66 books of the Protestant canon display this exact organic, progressive, redemptive unity. From Genesis 3 all the way through the end, he argues that the historical and exegetical evidence supports a singular, unified narrative centered on Jesus Christ. And he presents this as standing in stark contrast to the historical fragilities he was evaluating earlier on.
We've covered a ton of dense academic ground today. We looked really closely at how Marc Bates uses historical and exegetical tools to evaluate the logic of scriptural transmission and theological claims. But I want to leave you with a thought to ponder that goes way beyond just this text. How do rigorous historical critical methodologies actually impact modern interreligious dialogue? I mean, when we analyze foundational narratives for historical fragility, does it just shut down the conversation? Or does it actually demand a more robust, intellectually honest dialogue between faiths? It's a fascinating question and one totally worth exploring as you continue digging into this topic. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this breakdown gave you a clear, objective look at the mechanics at play here.